Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for giving us some time on your Friday evening. My name is Ann Thompson. I'm the Assistant Director for Public Services at the Essex Library, and I'm very honored to welcome you to a continuation of our 13th year of the Centerbrook Architects Lecture Series. Tonight, we're welcoming Theodore Sawruk, and he is going to be giving us some mayhem and merriment from Herat, Afghanistan. I have a little bit of housekeeping and some rules that I would like to set. So if you give me your ear for a minute. One is, I think you've already all done this anyway, but please keep your microphones muted and your cameras off so we preserve the bandwidth for these beautiful images. We will also take questions after the presentation. If you would put them in the chat as you think of them, or just hold on to them and you could unmute when we go into a question and answer period, that would be wonderful. And then the third thing, which is a huge favor to me, is if you have more than one person sitting with you, would you please put the number of people that are watching your screen in the chat? The State Library of Connecticut asks us to report all of the attendance to our programs, and that includes the Zoom programming. So if I can't see you, then I need to know how many people are with you. And I don't need names. We don't judge. We don't take attendance in that sense. We just need to know the number of people in the room. So thank you ahead in advance for that. I really appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to hand the introduction of Dr. Sawruk over to Jim Childress, partner at Centerbrook Architects.
Thank you. Glad to see all of you through Zoom. Ted, thanks so much. A number of you kindly wrote Ann in the past few months asking for some lectures focused more on history. And so we went to Mike Crosby, who's been a great supporter of us over the years. Said, Mike, who should we get? And Mike said, Ted. Ann reached out to Ted, and he came back with a couple ideas, one that I think he's going to do in April, and this one on Afghanistan, which I personally found fascinating. There's a whole world of architecture out there that none of us know anything about in places like Afghanistan and Bolivia and Chile, places like that. So I was fascinated with it. Ted is a professor at the graduate school at the University of Hartford, where he knows Mike, obviously. He has taught at Hampton University, Southern Polytechnic University, University of Arkansas, and Druid College. Got his bachelor's degree in architecture at Carnegie Mellon, and then went to the AA in London, the Architectural Association there. He's currently also working with faculty and administrators to establish an architecture program in Herat, Afghanistan. Maybe he'll talk a little bit about that. I think a strong suit of the University of Hartford program. You all have great interest in other places around the world. Ted, thrilled you're here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim. Yeah, as you mentioned, it was an interesting situation. When I came to the University of Hartford around 2007, the engineering program already had a relationship with the university in Herat. And previously in Afghanistan, there was only one major university, and that was in Kabul. And Herat, which is traditionally the summer vacation city of the royal family, did not have a university, but with support from the World Bank, they were establishing a new university there. A number of faculty, young students who were teaching in Kabul ended up coming to the University of Hartford for additional training, and then went back to Herat to start the engineering program there. As a part of that grant, they invited the architecture department to develop an architecture curriculum, and we went ahead and did that. In 2009, I was able to go to Herat for 2 months to help develop that curriculum and get it passed by the Ministry of Education. And while I was there, I took note of their architecture, and this lecture is more or less a byproduct of that experience. So that'll kind of carry forward here. With that, let's get started. So we're going to talk about mayhem and merriment, contemporary architecture in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan is a country rich in culture and history. but with an unfortunate recent past, one that has been mired in various wars for the past 3 decades. Despite significant social and economic achievements, the country is still considered to be a desolate battle defined by poverty and oppression. Afghanistan's long-standing reputation for hospitality and beautiful cities has been replaced by media images of death and destruction. Few people know anything about Afghanistan other than the recent violence that plagues the country. Afghanistan is in the process of a catastrophic change, devastating to some, exhilarating to others. As the doors open to Western ideology, the once isolated population is flooded with images, concepts, and opportunities. Long-standing traditions, constructs, and archetypes are being in part, or more often wholesale, abandoned, replaced by radical alternatives. These changes go far beyond gender roles, educational opportunities, and political solutions. The historic fabric of the city itself is being reconstructed. A new architecture of display is revealing itself. When I first entered the city of Herat, it appeared to be a mid-sized, thriving urban center, filled with the vitality of so many of its Mideast counterparts. However, within a few days, I was confronted by a stylistic collage of architectural manifestations, which revealed the fantastic world of Tim Burton or a retrofitted future of Ridley Scott. As an architect and a historian, I reveled in the ancient city and marveled at its modern counterpart. However, I was horrified by the recent incarnations, which had sprung forth like acne on a teen's fresh face. Confronted by the ghoul in the crowd, I was taken aback. The walled country house, the walled courtyard house, a centuries-old tradition, had given way to the freestanding multi-story concrete box. This was Afghanistan's vision of the McMansion. Interlopers had carved out a void in the cohesive fabric and presented themselves like Southern debutantes. However, lacking the refinement and elegance of gentle breeding, what burst on the scene was more akin to a burlesque stripper than a virtuous maiden. Exaggerated and ostentatious, these buildings screamed to be noticed. Lacking modesty and decorum, what was once private had been made public, and all had been crudely exposed. Yet how and why had this happened? To me, much of the work appeared thoughtless and irredeemable, actually ugly and grotesque in a vulgar way. Herat is perhaps the most beautiful of Afghan's ancient cities. It was settled over 2,500 years ago and was a major center for culture and learning in the 1300s. At its height and its glory, the city was the capital of the Timurid Empire and hosted one of the largest university complexes in the world. Today, the Citadel of Alexander, the 5 minarets, and the Friday Mosque are but a few remnants of the golden age of architecture. Beyond the walled medieval city lay the construct of a more modern urbanity, one of tree-lined avenues and 20th century monuments. Pure geometric forms of white and gray support the classicism of British rule, the cubism of a progressive monarchy, and the rationalism of a Soviet invasion. Combine They form a cohesive context of international style neighborhoods and the hierarchy of a successful 20th century urban plan. It took weeks of conscientious observation and quiet contemplation to begin to understand the nuances of the people and the new world they were building. The transition of historic prototypes into private temples for the nouveau riche is often considered reactionary and by some academics as a betrayal of larger cultural values. As an established architecture historian, did I initially reject these incarnations as the bastardization of canons I had been raised to hold dear? Where was the restraint of Indigo Jones, the rigor of Friedrich Schinkel, or the mastery of Victor Horta? Did I instinctively reject them as one generation might reject the music of the next? It's not what I like to hear. It doesn't sound nice or pleasant to me. I suddenly became conscious that my personal reaction mimicked that of a stern parent as opposed to an accepting grandparent. I initially frowned upon these expressions as one might criticize a disrespectful child. There's no restraint, there's no decorum. Or one's aunt might be heard to say, there is no proper etiquette. Yet my education taught me that there was a construct of pluralism that allowed for the simultaneous existence of both high and low culture. Is the postmodern city something that can easily be mixed? With fewer than 10 active architects in the city of Herat, recent building is left to the realm of engineers and contractors who market status, virility, glamour, or as Jenks proposes, desire. During the war years, Afghan refugees migrated to neighborhood Islamic countries in vast numbers. Upon their return, they brought with them a fondness for newfound architectural styles. Pre-existing plans imported from Iran, Pakistan, and India are revised and easily resold to these new wealthy clients. The vitality and vulgarity of Afghan postmodernism is clearly a product of these influences, but still has its roots in American and European models. With an almost Victorian aesthetic, contemporary architecture is less about context, continuity, and complement, and more about the desire for abundance in all aspects of building, texture, pattern, and materiality. To Western eyes, it is a shock, but to local Afghans, these new houses are modern palaces. All aspects of the country and culture are under attack from the outside world. Some you choose to retreat into tradition and centuries-old religion. Others consume the new ideology and technology as fast as they can. The old architecture, the world of internationalism and rationalism, now seems too mundane, too bland, too homogeneous. There are somehow brutal and oppressive. To the nouveau riche, this is the architecture of poverty, of inner city neighborhoods in decline. The new architecture appears to be an oasis in the desert. Color, movement, and ornament all bring these Persian palaces to life. Renovated and remodeled, the new grammar is a kind of Islamic Art Nouveau or Art Deco, a combination of pastel colors and free form or geometric fenestration. Dynamic, ostentatious, and sublime, the facades appear to be appeal to the general public on multiple levels. They begin to create a modernity in Herat Baudelaire would find fascinating. Architecture fantasy manifests in many ways. It is often spectacular, but it is not easy to categorize and analyze. Perhaps that is what fantastic means, to be so exciting or strange as to be indescribable. The new architecture supports a world of artisans, artists, and eccentrics. They arrive at their forms with the complete freedom and fantasy, and without the restrictions of zoning laws and building codes. These are dreams made tangible and represent a proof of being. The homeowners depict themselves through these personal narratives. They have the will to build and to remake their surroundings. Each palace is an individual expression and serves as a symbol of the family's thinking, values, and innermost selves. Eliminating the elite tastemakers that organize the world along lines of rigor, these individuals build fantasies, extravagant fancy, or rather, fantasies with a PH. When spelled with a PH, the word is more akin to its original ancient Greek usage, the mental progress of visual perception of things that are not actually present, i.e., visionary. In general, the visionary represents a theoretical, speculative, or even poetic statement. That is likely to be ahead of its time, prophetic, or utopian. Whether fantasy with an F or fantasy with a PH, one cannot deny that what we have are built bizarre versions that reside in the realm of follies, like the ideal palace of the postman Cheval or Antonio Gaudi's Casa Batillo, or even Frank Gehry's Santa Monica house. They are fanciful, elusive, and truly personal. It is obvious that these homes are eccentric, and in many cases, fantastic constructions are immediately rejected by their neighbors as strange and unacceptable. It results in isolation and/or open aggression. Yet, as they continue to flourish, there seems to be little obvious intention to halt their proliferation. Maybe what is disturbing to us is not that these fantasies randomly appear throughout the urban context, but more that they constitute an architecture style on the fringe, an extracurricular manifestation, which may just become a mainstream movement. What we have in these homes is an analogy to the French ingé doux, meaning low tech, translated into English as folk architecture. The more recent reference is perhaps vernacular architecture. An article in Architecture Aujourd'hui, a French periodical, suggests that although not limited to any one country, there is a tendency for soft architecture to appear in the United States. The article illustrates that the phenomenon is particularly American, where we tend to reject the academic. It reverts to idealistic and liberal individualism and is essentially an anti-urban manifestation. There exist a number of primary studies related to the merits of popular or folk architecture, as initially pioneered by Bernard Radowski, Amos Rappaport, and Paul Oliver. A fairly early explorer of the subject, Sybil Moholy-Nagy, in keeping with her Bauhaus background, underscored the ingenuous, adaptive, and character of folk building. Buildings, she wrote, are transmitters of life. They transmit the life of the past into the lives of the future. Perhaps the Persian palace is the cure to Afghani deconstruction, a way of transcending the past and reinventing the future. But what impact could this new popular architecture have on high culture? George Collins suggests that traditional folk architecture, with its overt symbolism and elements of realistic representation, inspired the postmodern movement. Could these new palaces be the same trace, come full circle? Could the works of high cultured architects like Graves, Beaufield, and Stern be somehow made more democratic if they were mimicked by low or popular culture? Is this bizarre architecture somehow more egalitarian when viewed as the efforts of untrained citizens clamoring to participate in the rebuilding of their cities through the exploration of functions and symbols that are personally meaningful? Could these bizarre visions be an expression of an emerging avant-garde Afghan style of architecture? Upon close inspection, one finds it is all but a thin veil, inches of concrete applied to traditional mud brick shells. The ornate facades are like clown makeup applied to Greek statues. Almost Gothic in nature, many facades start out as a pure expression of structure. The core structure is the traditional Domino House, the modernist reinforced concrete prototype of columns and slabs. Doors and windows are freely composed within the terracotta brick infill walls, and the entire shell is covered with a thin stucco facade. Until this point, the construction of these new houses resembles their traditional reserve counterpoints. The next step, as Robert Venturi might say, is to decorate the shed. Reveling in the post-war prosperity of economic expansion, political freedom, and access to global technology, the newly empowered citizens seem to be thrown into an aesthetic frenzy with the zeal of a Pentecostal congregation. An endless variety of classical details, sinuous ironwork, and garish colors are combined to embellish the facades. There is no one stylistic canon, so therefore all historic styles and motif are fair game as decoration. The compositions of creative lay craftsmen, these vernacular expressions lack the refinement and precision of their original academic inspirations. They wantonly disregard proportion and scale. Instead, they are individually eccentric and expressive. Repetitive, rescaled, extruded, the multi-layers of fenestration wrap the projecting balconies and undulating roofs with the exuberance of a wedding cake decorator. French Rococo-influenced arabesque designs are in many ways a feminine counterpoint to the Italian Mannerist-influenced compound curved structures. Often Romanesque in form, every function of the building is revealed and articulated on the exterior, defined by a shape or form. The privacy characteristic of the walled house has been stripped bare, and the family has now been placed on exhibition. The viewers from the street are not only permitted, but encouraged to read the building's spatial organization and physical hierarchy. But these classical incarnations owe their origins less to the realm of Palladio, Alberti, and Campbell, and more to the constructs of fantastic entertainments. I am reminded of the designs of Da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Indigo Jones for their public celebrations, fetes, and private masks of the Medicis and other European aristocrats. The mask was an elaborate elaboration of a kind of public entertainment particular to their age. The architect was entrusted with the scenery, the stage effects, and the costumes. Freed of the constraints of civic and religious responsibility, these architects allowed their imaginations to run wild with unbridled creativity. Temporary in nature, these street decorations sought to enlist an emotional response and to create a festival environment. Their purpose was to amuse and bring joy to the common man, while simultaneously supporting the public events taking place in the lives of the aristocracy. Theatrical urban scenery of the 16th century served as a basis of 17th century operatic scenery. In turn, their inspiration became the model for later Baroque urban architecture. Could these contemporary urban manifestations do the same for Afghan architecture? Or are these merely temporary constructs intended to amuse and entertain? Is more likely that they will go the way of other short-lived Mannerist expressions like the Rococo or the deconstructivist. Could they somehow be an alternative to the romantic city promoted by Andreas Dewani and the delirious modernity of Rem Koolhaas? I would suggest that they could easily serve to inspire a radically new idealized streetscape, one that mimics Piranesi's Via Appia or Serlio's comedy and tragedy. Perhaps what the Afghan Nouveau Riche seek to create is a promenade architectural, made famous by foreign visitors to Italy in 1640. Genoa's Via Nuova took on worldwide acclaim for the variety and vitality of its residential architecture. An English visitor wrote that the street surpassed for spirit all the streets I have ever seen. Ordinary houses, he declared, are so out of countenance here that they do not appear in the streets, where there is nothing but palaces, and palaces as fine as art and cost or marble and painting can make them. His admiration centered on the rare and spectacular stateliness of the buildings, turning away from other ordinary Renaissance pomp typical throughout the rest of Genoa. The brainchild of Alessi, a pupil of Michelangelo, the street was in a category all its own. It formed a residential quarter, or more precisely, an aristocratic ghetto. Each house was uniquely designed and lavishly articulated, a monumental procession of pomp and circumstances. A vista presented a cavalcade of stars. The street was blocked at each end and created a marble square solely for the use of the public promenade. It is a street without perspectives. There is no other way to enjoy it but to walk through it step by step. The dimension of time is essential. The situation in Genoa, mirrors that of Herat. Genoa's patricians were essentially a mercantile bourgeoisie, grown fat and living in true architectural luxury. Kevin Roderick, in his article, Reconstructing the Persian Palace, suggests the same may be true of Afghan palaces. The owners of these fantasies merely want to enliven the street and their own surroundings by plucking the familiar images from the glories of architectural history and turning them into a kind of gold leafing. Would the Piazza d'Italia be more at home in Herat than in New Orleans? Are the intentions of these builders any different than that of the Doge of Venice or London's John Nash? Like their contemporaries, the streets of Herat also enlist a response of awe and wonder, and perhaps these builders long to remake the city as an amusement park, and the urban streetscape as a lavish Coney Island boardwalk or a Disneyland Main Street. For the realization of Carnival is a serious manifestation of city pluralism and the celebration of difference and the end of a totalitarian aesthetic. Is Herat to become a riot of otherness? For unchecked, Herat could easily become the marvelous land of Oz as conceived by L. Frank Baum. Yet, harsh critics might hold a sarcastic tongue, as there is a historic precedent for these fantastic incarnations. With a broader perspective, one can see characteristics which go beyond physical pastiche and are more sincerely reminiscent of the Victorian Queen Anne movement. Are there parallels between Persian palaces and, say, the post-Civil War homes of American industrialists? Both expressions are the result of immense wealth acquired during a post-war economic expansion. Both cultures suffered extensive destruction and unimaginable loss due to war. Both chose to abandon a traditional culture and embrace an industrial technological alternative. Both artifacts seek to exhibit their owners and announce his newfound prosperity to the community at large. Both take full advantage of the skills of every and all craftsmen at their disposal and almost push them to their creative limits. Both compose a collage of sculptural forms overlaid with arbitrary, excessive, and extensive ornamentation. There is no hesitation to use bright or vibrant paint, and a complement of numerous and varying colors is almost necessary. Gone is the economic and efficient machine for living. Embellished by railings, light fixtures, and an assortment of accents, these houses are both jewel-encrusted treasure chests for pleasure. The new Islamic house reveals in the visual and tactile and demands the sensual. Will these Persian palaces become the future painted ladies of Herat? But there is something more serious beyond the festive, colorful, and exuberant facades. After all, these family homes still represent an architectural style of privilege and power. If one removes the mask, what lies beyond the surface? Ian Pollard discusses the use of veneers of didactic meaning. Modern eclecticism started as a quest for the lost aura and has grown into an exemplar of industrial kitsch. And if in kitsch nothing succeeds like excess, the Persian palace gets high marks. In a postmodern city, kitsch is endowed with moral and aesthetic value via the construct of pluralism. They are redeemed as grotesques, as frightening artifacts that embody specific values and tell us about consumer man and the runaway menagerie of his overstimulated mind. These Nero-like palaces reflect the triumph of Western style, free marketing exchange, and the growing wealth of an evolving and expanding bourgeoisie. They reveal the struggle between the individual and the more liberal, yet still traditional state. This is a social class precariously trying to reinvent itself. It is consumed by status and infatuated with fetish. It somehow seeks to mirror its Western counterpart, expressing their values while injecting some of their own. Western inspired, there is still a very personal Islamic aesthetic at work. Here, less is not more, less is truly less. More is more, and conspicuous consumption means Trump-like success. These houses are, for all intensive purposes, the backdrop for a Farsi-dubbed Dallas, Dynasty, or Falcon's Crest lifestyle. Running through these endeavors like a continuous thread is always the impulsive towards an ideal or utopian. One must assume the client is building his conception of perfection, a viable response to his time and place in society. These are not academic exercises meant to provoke thought or enlist cultural criticism. They are the built aspirations of their owners. At times, especially after some crisis, there is a temptation to seek a simple perspective, a vision of perfection. In one way, they are returned to the traditional syntax of forms, materials, and decoration, which are readily understood and recognized by the global general public. But there is an accessibility to the root of their demise. Charles Jenks relays that the translation of historic prototypes into private temples for the nouveau riche is often considered reactionary and by some a betrayal. If we go one step further and consider the commodification of culture, there is a reality related to consumerism, where marketable objects and styles are quickly consumed and subsumed and immediately become devalued. And maybe this is why the Persian palace appears so unacceptable and irredeemable to us. Is this a mirror reflection of our own values as revealed to us through the actions of our cultural children? For in many ways, it is our goal to impart Western democratic values upon these people and to remake their economic and political system in our own image. Does the shock and horror of what they have wrought belong to us alone? Are we, in all honesty, criticizing our own reflection? The philosophy of deconstructivism is not an issue even considered in contemporary Afghanistan, for deconstruction exists in every aspect of daily life. It is neither exhilarating nor sublime. 30 years of war, turmoil, violence, and destruction have left the country actively struggling to survive, actively seeking to find stability. As such, the architecture of Herat has changed dramatically as new buildings begin to emerge. The classicism associated with the British period and the rationalism imposed by the Russian occupation have been abandoned as models. The city is now overrun with a festival of built expressions and stylistic representation one could only describe as Islamic Mannerism. In conclusion, the evolving city of Herat has become a true pluralistic environment, and the variety of styles and habitation has generated a multitude of confusing yet significant representations and meanings. Yet all of these new constructs are interlopers into the Muslim world. They bring change, but at what cost? What merit does the Persian palace bring to the city beyond the display of individual wealth? Do they serve a greater purpose for those who have lost so much? They ignore, abandon, and obliterate centuries-old tradition, leaving us to ask, is the influx of foreign styles on this ancient city a progressive evolution or the total collapse of local and traditional culture? Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you, Ted, so much for that. I have a lot of questions. That was just such a fascinating overview, but I can't help but think that maybe there are some pictures that you didn't include. So I'm going to let everybody think about their questions. And if you have them, please type them into the chat. And while you're doing that, I just have a couple of of pieces of news. One is that Ted is going to be back with us to unleash his fury on history of architectural styles. So if you're interested in the history of architecture, please join us on April 9th. And Ted is going to do a review of style for us so that all of these other things will make more sense after we hear about that. But in between now and then, we have the incredible George Miller, who worked with Paycob Fried for more than 40 years. He was the managing partner there. And he is going to be speaking to us about the winning ways of IM Pay on March 19th at 7 o'clock, another Friday evening as well. And so please make sure that you register for that, because I've seen the talk, and George is with us tonight. And it bodes very well to get a deep review both of the man and his career, but also a lot of really interesting takes on the site constrictions and the influence they had on 4 major projects that Paycob Fried did over the years. All right, so let's get to the questions. I know one very quickly is, have more public institutions like businesses, government, and religious institutions started building or rebuilding? And if so, are they following in a similar vein as what we saw tonight?
That's a really interesting question. Unfortunately, this is a very strange situation. Like I said, when I arrived there were only 9 registered architects, and only 2 of them were actually practicing architecture. And the situation there is that all buildings need to be certified by an engineer. So much of the building is actually controlled by engineers. And although they have very little interest in the style or the expression of architecture, what ends up happening is they often just acquire plans from other locations and then certify those and build those. So many of the government buildings were still being built in sort of the traditional Soviet modernism. And this new expression was more or less the byproduct of the bourgeoisie, this new emerging wealthy merchant class that was kind of negotiating and sort of buying and selling goods and services. I will say this, that when I was there, it was a strange kind of cultural combination. I could have any Western soda I ever wanted. I mean, I could have a Coke, a Tab, a Pepsi, you know, a Mountain Dew. Any of those things were readily available, as were beverages and things from China and Russia. At the same time, in a conflict of Muslim values, shows like The New Adventures of Old Christine, a TV show about a divorced single mother who maintains a relationship with her husband while she's dating somebody else, and Will and Grace were popular TV shows. So it was sort of like this weird, you know, transitional kind of phase where obviously there were some groups that were devoutly religious and very much, you know, entrenched in, if you want to call it, a sort of post-Taliban values. But then there was also this nouveau riche that was really sort of consuming Western culture as much as they could, kind of thing.
So that jumps into the second question, which is very close to what you just maybe have answered, is it all seems more Western influenced and not Islamic influenced. And is there a message in that?
Well, this was what, I mean, I was really, like I said in the presentation, at first I was really pretty critical. And then when I started to consider our own culture and the evolution of our culture, and, you know, I certainly, you know, if you sort of place the Victorian period of the United States in this sort of post-Civil War period and suddenly realize that that wild expression, I mean, is there anything more academic about a Queen Anne house than a Persian palace? When you're sort of mixing styles and you're mixing materials and everything is brightly colored. And in some ways, the architecture could be seen as a celebration of liberty and freedom, freedom of expression. And as I said, it engaged all these different craftspeople. I mean, everything from inlaid floors to fancy iron railings to stained glass. I mean, the craftsmen were certainly being utilized to their fullest extent, but maybe not in the way that, you know, our more modernist tastes would approve of.
Certainly. So that takes us to the modern. So the next question is, there were some simple, beautiful, but simple buildings in your last image. Is there another more sophisticated architecture starting to emerge?
I would think so. And one of the things that's happened recently is about 4 years ago, we had our first class of graduate architects, you know, graduate from the program. I will mention something which is really ironic. Architecture, when the program was being developed in Afghanistan, could not challenge the male-dominated engineers. And so this is going to be one of the strangest things you could imagine. So architecture was actually developed as a career for women. And this second part of this was that since you couldn't challenge the sort of engineering / structural component of architecture, the engineers had no interest in urban design, house design, or historic preservation. And so those three became sort of the basis of the architecture curriculum, because men were not permitted to design houses, because in order to design a house, you would have to talk to the wife, and a man could not talk to another man's wife. So it had to be a female architect who could talk to the wife and could also then talk to the owner. That was one thing. And the engineers had no interest in urban design or historic preservation. So women could take over those roles and not challenge men.
Wow.
So that's another interesting kind of thing. Like, you know, we're struggling to sort of bring more women and minorities into the architecture profession. Whereas in Herat, if you want to be an architect, it's viewed primarily as a female profession.
Wow. Interesting. All right, that is a lot of food for thought. Mary says, thanks, Ted. I enjoyed and I learned so much. The Herat landscape reminds me of other landscapes of the Middle East. And also Bulgaria boasts plenty of nouveau riche and ostentatious constructions too. So that, yeah, nobody's got a monopoly on that.
You know, and as I said at the end, I think the thing that's interesting to us is, again, this sort of mirror of our culture. And many of you who are listening are probably old enough to have children. And when your children sort of say something back to you, which you know that you taught them, but they've reinterpreted it in their own sort of context, and you sort of go like, okay, wait a second. I taught you that, but now what you're telling me is slightly different. And I wonder if that is part of what's interesting or what's happening here, is they're looking at our culture and they're picking from our culture either what they understand or what they appreciate or what they feel familiar with. And then they're sort of projecting that back at us, but we might not recognize it right away as being related to something that we gave them.
Right. Interesting. Next question is from Reza, so the comment is, first of all, thank you for all the good and rich information. I am from Afghanistan and I came to New Haven, Connecticut 7 years ago. My question is, what would be good practice to save those architectural structures from being destroyed? I heard on the news a few weeks ago that, and I'm not sure if I'll pronounce this correctly, Jami's tombs of Herat are in danger.
Okay. One good thing is that the old city of Herat, which was founded prior to Alexander the Great and has been continuously inhabited up until today, that sort of inner city of 8 or 10 blocks by 10 blocks is now a UNESCO heritage site. So many of the older buildings that had been left to sort of fall into disrepair under the Soviet and Taliban rule are now being restored with funds from the World Bank and from UNESCO. So fortunately, within that confined, things will be preserved. I think the unfortunate thing is that they may not appreciate much of the British or even the Soviet architecture, which, like I said, has this really unique modernist feel. And those may be sort of swept aside more readily than the ancient stuff. Although once you leave the inner city, there are many, many, many unfortunate landmarks which are just being allowed to fall into disrepair because there aren't any funds nor the interest to go out and salvage them. I actually have a book of measured drawings of historic sites that were put together by a group of students. This is maybe 15, 20 years ago, before they were really falling into disrepair. I wish that our interest was more in saving the art and culture than, modernizing as such. What you didn't see in those pictures is that many of the new structures are high-rise concrete frame buildings. And again, the hotel I stayed in was 12 stories in the center of the city, and much of the new construction is to take an existing site and just go up as such. So that sort of 4, 5, 6-story plane may be interrupted very quickly in the next few years.
Interesting. So one question I had was there's a limited materials palette, obviously. Probably very little wood is available, and what is maybe used very precious, a very precious material, obviously. So in these newer buildings, does there seem to be a material that is more prized or more used poorly, so to speak, or is there some of this being driven by a lack of other materials? A lot of it is shiny, obviously, in terms of tiling and things like that, the metal.
Well, I think, and this is sort of another interesting situation, which is there are a lot of traditional crafts, like I said, inlaid floors, stained glass, iron work, these kind of things. And so what you see is what's available is readily utilized and translated into gates and railings and glass windows. On the other hand, things like solar glass or metal, chrome, brass, those things are imported from Iran, China, all over the place. And so that's another kind of aspect of this kind of nouveau riche as such, that you have that. And if you saw, almost all of the houses have a gate in the front, and that opens into, so what had once been a courtyard that may have been for entertainment, for children, for plants, flowers, possibly, a fountain or something, are now paving for cars. And so where the house wrapped around this sort of private garden in the center, it's been inverted. So now the box is in the center, and around the outside is where you put the car. And you could ask yourself, well, where is the place where the family sort of gathers in this sort of external family unit? and that sort of disappeared as such. It's also strange because in the traditional families, people still stay very kind of hidden away and their lives are very private. And if you look at all of these new structures, they're exemplified by wide expanse of glass windows that let you look in, and sort of that transparency that not only lets you see what they're doing, but what wealth they have and if they're socializing or any of those kind of things, which never would have happened 15, 20 years ago. That never would have been acceptable in their culture.
I feel like as an American, I feel like we should be saying, do as I say, not as I do.
Kind of thing. Well, it's very funny because I mentioned this to students once. We were talking about this idea of transparency. And although some people come from a culture of putting fences up, and from the time when maybe you had cattle or animals, but in suburbia, I remember sort of sharing this with somebody. If someone in our neighborhood put a fence up, everybody was saying to themselves, why did they put up a fence?
Right.
What are they doing in there that they don't want us to see? You should be able to see into if you're not doing anything wrong, everybody can see in, and so suddenly if somebody put up an 8-foot fence around their yard, everybody started talking about, well, what are they doing that no one is allowed to see, kind of thing. Which is sort of this inverse, why are you showing off, and those kind of things.
Interesting.
So
I want you to put on your future seer's hat. And do you see an evolution of this as historical cycles go? Do you see this changing in 20 or 50 years?
Oh, I would think that the reality is, and this becomes another question, after 30 years or an entire generation and a half, let's say, of people acclimating to their oppressors. So in other words, during the British rule, there was, classicism. During the monarchy, which was sort of a liberal period, they embraced, Bauhaus modernism. And then under the Soviets, they, again, engaged in rationalism. So is this merely are they presenting to us what they think we want? And my question would be, if they gained independence and established a truly stable and prolific economy, and sort of grew into their own identity, what would that be? I don't think that the Persian palaces would hold as much weight as they probably do now.
Interesting. Did you see much of a clash between the very traditional, maybe more conservative families, or I mean, if there are neighborhoods versus the people who are doing more of the wedding cake
Sure.
exuberance?
Well, one of the things that was very funny in this situation is, and this is again would challenge some of our preconceptions, was that it was really the individuals who were, let's say, between 20 and 30, who had not had the opportunity to be educated, that were highly conservative and traditional. Older individuals who may have been 50 to 70 actually secretly were more liberal because they had been younger during the monarchy when things were open. And I was invited by the dean to a dinner party, which basically turned out to be myself and all of the men, and we were waited on by the teenage male children, yet the meal had actually been prepared by the female members of the family. And I'm a very touchy-feely person. And so at the end of the evening, when we were leaving, the dean introduced me to his wife and his daughters. And I naturally just sort of reached out and took her hand and said, "Oh, thank you so very much for the meal. You know, I really enjoyed it," and blah, blah, blah. And she was like, "Oh," and she sort of blushed and was very friendly or whatever. And afterwards, when I got into the car to go back to the hotel, my advisor chastised me. And he's like, "I can't believe you touched her. How dare you touch her? You know, you're a man, she's a woman. You can't touch women in Muslim culture," and those kind of things. And so the next day, when we went to the university, I went to the dean's office and I said, "Oh, I'm so very sorry. I'm sorry if I offended your wife. I didn't mean anything." And he smiled and he said to me, "Oh, Ted, my wife loved it. She said it reminded her of the good old days when we could be friendly and those things." And so ironically, my faux pas had actually been well received by her, but was considered atrocious by some of the younger faculty.
That's
And
fascinating.
so there's a sort of an issue, which is you have a more liberal older population and a more conservative younger population.
Wow, that's a lot of navigating. Fascinating, really fascinating. Well, I think I've monopolized your question and answer period. Does anybody else want to unmute themselves and ask Ted anything? Please feel free. No? All right.
Well, maybe they're hungry.
There's-
No, I asked mine through the chat. It was a wonderful, wonderful talk, Ted. Love
George,
it.
did I see you want to say something?
Well, yes, Ted, thanks for a great presentation. I'm kind of curious if there are any kind of planning principles that are in place in the city. Is there any kind of urban design that's underway now, or is it just an individual may own a lot and just put up whatever they want? So is zoning something that's considered there?
Yes and no. My experience was that, and this is sort of an interesting situation because zoning was put in place from the top down, yet, as you can imagine, a little bit of, financial remediation here or there kind of let you do whatever you wanted to do, kind of thing. So nobody really stopped them from tearing down a traditional courtyard house and putting up a Persian palace. Now I have started a dialogue with the new chair of the architecture department, and she and I are considering various new topics to do some shared research. And George's question, what has happened, let's say over the last 10 years with urban planning, would certainly be a topic worth discussing. Because you can imagine under the Soviets, there was a lot of top-down decision-making as to what would and wouldn't happen. Right now, it's a little bit more of a free market situation, and I don't think how can I say this? I don't think any of the Americans, well, also the Italians tended to be the ones that were overseeing part of Herat and so forth, were really interested in what happened architecturally. They were interested in maybe commerce, economics, religious unrest, political unrest, those things, but things were sort of left open as far as those things. Other than, as I said, UNESCO pretty quickly sort of tried to tie up the historic city so that nothing would be destroyed there through just development and that kind of stuff. But once you leave that, things were still pretty much up in the air. But we'll see. I'll check over the next couple months and maybe be back in a year or so with a new interpretation of what's going on then.
That would be wonderful. All right, no other questions?
Okay.
All right, Ted, thank you so very much for
It's my pleasure. Thank you
Thank you,
so much.
Ted.
I hope everybody enjoyed it. And, we always try to give you some good images and a couple of fun comments and some ideas to think about. But I would also say this, a very progressive culture, very friendly, very peaceful culture. Please do not judge the average Afghan by the Taliban or those kind of things. I found them to be an extremely gentle, warm, and for the most part, educated group of people. And so I think they've been sort of cast in a very bad light in order to facilitate the military occupation.
Yeah, I